Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm your host, Alexander F., and today we are so excited to talk about traditional astrology with return guest Eric Purdue. And I know many listeners are familiar with Eric. Eric is a practitioner of medieval astrology and a centero in Lucumi Santeria. Eric has also been on the podcast before to discuss his 896-page translation of the occult classic Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. And so definitely make sure, listeners, if you have not checked out that podcast, please check it out. It's full of so much great information. In addition, though, in this podcast, Eric is taking some time to stop by and to discuss traditional astrology. And you might be asking, listeners, what is traditional astrology? What does it actually mean? What does it mean to have something be traditional versus non-traditional? How did traditional astrology actually evolve? What are the differences in astrology, especially if you might not be too familiar, between electional astrology, natal astrology, medical astrology, mundane astrology, calculating for a magical operation, all of those things? Well, Eric Purdue is one of the best people to ask about this with his astrological experience. And so I'm excited because Eric not only has the ability to approach things from a scholarly perspective, but he also approaches it from a deep practical perspective as well. So I'm looking forward to getting into this conversation. And I also want to give a quick shout out to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon because of your amazing support for the podcast and your excellent questions for guests like Eric as well. And so with all that being said, and to help us uncork the uncommon, Eric Purdue, thank you so much for stopping by and stopping on the Glitch Bottle podcast again. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Eric, the honor's mine. I have to admit, we were just talking about this before we started recording, that I am one of those people. I will just open by confessing that my knowledge of astrology outside of making calculations for a grimoire operation, definitely I am always learning. I am always growing. So you're like the perfect person to ask. And I guess, Eric, the best place to start might be, can you share with us, when it comes to traditional astrology, what does that mean? Like, what are the elements or time constraints that define traditional astrology?
I'm starting to actually hate that title. I keep feeling like there should be a better word. Lately I've been saying pre-modern. It's such a popular term, so I'm going to use it. So basically traditional astrology, most people define it as pre-18th century astrology. That is all of the dates that I will probably discuss are kind of fluid. They're convenient time periods. So the 18th century is another convenient time period. The reality is that there were some good astrologers that came after that were still doing the old ways. They were just dwindling at that point. Are we going doing a definition or just defining? I don't want to hijack any questions.
Absolutely not. Please feel free to just lay out whatever terms or whatever you feel people might know. Because you're right. So many people might, especially you go on social media and you see all these different things about astrology and different approaches. So feel free. Absolutely.
Okay. So simply put, astrology as we know it started in the roughly 2nd century BC in the Hellenistic region, probably Egypt. And now that always gets a little dicey with people because we know that Babylonians did astrology. Undoubtedly, it was an influence. There's no question. The reason why people usually start there is because the astrology that the Babylonians did was quite different So they used planets. They had they tracked the stars, constellations, and things like that. But it took more of a ominal bent, if that makes sense. So I'm going to make this example up off the top of my head, but the old text will say things like, Venus is low in the sky next to XYZ star. The crops will wither this year. It'll be something like that. But they typically didn't have, like personal birth charts, things like that. Sometimes they would do some predictions for the king because that kind of had that affected the kingdom as well, the actual country. But it was very different. I mean, the notion that we have today of astrology being the sort of personalized prediction system really arose, at least from the texts. I mean, this is all we have to go by during the Hellenistic period. And the reason why that's kind of notable is because it was a sort of synthesis between the foundation that the Babylonians laid with some Egyptian influences. Because the Egyptians really, as far as we can tell, also really didn't do the astrology as the way we would recognize it. Although some elements we would. So we took some elements from that, and they took some philosophical elements from Plato. There's some Pythagorean influence in there. All this kind of, like everything else in the Hellenistic period, just kind of became this big soup into something new, And we had what some people today call horoscopic astrology. So horoscopic astrology, the horoscope really means rising sign, the sign that is on the horizon at a certain time. Not the horizon, the eastern horizon, which is rising at that point. The Greeks developed, or at least apparently the Greeks developed the math to calculate the degree of the rising, the sign that was rising, and so that appeared to be a fairly new development, and that was a major defining feature. So that kind of opened up the floodgates to everything that we think of as astrology today. And by it's an interesting thing because it almost came into being nearly fully formed. That's what it looks like, at least, because we don't have these texts that show this kind of like evolution of, oh, now we're going to have aspects, and oh, this is the first time aspects showed up, or this is the first time planetary strength came up, or things like that. It's just all there at once, and someone developed it somewhere, but we don't have the texts. So the earliest text that we have a pretty full system. That was around the 2nd century BC, and things developed from there, right? Quite dramatically.
So to take an example, and again, just I'm thinking also, for example, in a grimoire context, if you are consecrating a mercurial talisman, or you are engaging with a spirit, on the day and hour during a Wednesday, correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, that in the 2nd century, the Greeks might have been the first to really focus on, okay.
I should say Hellenists, because it was probably other ethnic groups.
Yes. The kind of Hellenistic societies there in the 2nd century were kind of the first to say, okay, well, during this operation, you need to wait, for example, until Gemini is rising above the eastern horizon for a specific working, or this could yield to this, or if Cancer is rising, or is that kind of how they
sort of?
Okay.
So for magical workings, it gets a little bit more complex because what we think of today as astrological magic, there's very little evidence that existed in the Hellenistic period. There was certainly some kind of magic that related to the stars. I think that's always existed in some way. But the sort of system that we have now, where we have these complicated astrological elections to find out when the best time to make a talisman for Venus or a lunar mansion or something like that, That didn't seem to exist yet. I think the Greek magical papyri has one, at least one, probably more, operation for I think the Pleiades or one of the constellations. But it's nothing. It's quite simple in comparison. It isn't nearly the same type of operation. That what we think of as astrological magic came later in the Arabic period.
Okay. So then to this point, then can you share with us a little bit about the evolution of astrology? So you, as you mentioned, the second century, kind of the Hellenistic communities at that time, how did it kind of change, grow, blossom until it got into a form that maybe somebody today who's looking at Agrippa or reading a grimoire in kind of the European context might go, oh, this is recognizable? Or how did this evolve over the centuries?
The earliest books that we have are recognizable. That's the funny thing. The earliest books that, at least that we think there were, because they don't exist anymore, were some books that were written by, they say, two Egyptian pharaohs. That's what they used to say. Pedosiris and Hatshepsut. And those books don't exist anymore. They've been quoted, so we have fragments of them. I think the earliest text that survived, if I'm not mistaken, is, at least substantial text, is Dorotheus, if I'm not mistaken. I think that was second century. But we have, by the time you have Dorotheus, it's completely recognizable. You have signs, planets, aspects, an essential dignity, which is a way of determining planetary strength. You have predictive rules, all sorts of things. But yeah, some notable things then. I mean, you have Dorotheus, of course, you have Ptolemy, Tetrabiblos, that's the most famous. Ptolemy was a little bit of a renegade. He stated that he disagreed with some of the astrological texts that were out at the time. So he kind of developed his own system. And it's not really as rich in some ways, as far as predictive techniques go, as other books were. There's a lot there. But compared to some other authors, it's a little bit on the thinner side. A lot of modern day Hellenistic astrologers don't follow him as much. They follow the big guy, which is Vettius Valens. That's probably the largest text that survived, and I don't think it's complete even. It's a pretty hefty book. I think it was originally 21 or 24 volumes or something like that, or scrolls. It'd be scrolls, not modern day volumes, but still a pretty hefty book. And basically from Valens on, or actually Dorotheus and Valens and some of the other authors that came a little bit after, that's the framework that everybody went from afterwards. Ptolemy sort of developed this reputation for being like the one to beat. I guess everybody. Tetrabiblos, which is his book, is a very difficult book to read. Even to ancient Greeks, it was a hard book to read. And some of the statements he made were kind of cryptic. And astrologers, ever since he published the book, have been trying to understand some of the concepts he talks about, all the way up until 17th century. They were arguing about certain things. But yeah, so I guess developments. So in the, I guess it would be 5th century or so, with the fall of the Roman Empire, this is sort of a well-known story about the philosophical schools being disbanded and all that. The astrology went with it. And so astrology kind of died out for the most part in the West. And it got picked up in Constantinople and in Persia. Persia never let it go. And they continued their own developments. Eventually, with the rise of Islam, the Persian material and the Byzantine material was translated into Arabic. And that is really the root of, I think, what we're doing today. That's it's because of that we have Ptolemy and several other books. Dorotheus there's no Greek copy that's survived. And the Persians and the Arab, when I'm saying Arabs, I'm saying this collectively. I don't mean Saudi Arabia. I'm talking about the Islamic world in general. Made their own developments. They were taking the Hellenistic material and they refined it and worked with it. And I think it's probably some of the most valuable material that survived. One of the earliest astrologers during that period was Mashallah. And he was part of, forgive my pronunciations, everybody. I think you speak Arabic, don't you?
A little bit.
Okay.
You're doing fantastic.
All right. Mashallah was part of an organization, the Brethren of Purity, that established the electional chart to found Baghdad, which I think is a fascinating fact. So we actually know when Baghdad exactly was founded. And so he was a notable astrologer, Abu Mashar. I always call him the Beatles of astrology. Abu Mashar wrote a lot and wrote about material that really people hadn't written down on paper in that much detail before. He's immensely valuable, and everybody, all the Arabic astrologers worked off of Abu Mashar after that. And he's only recently been, a lot of his books have only been recently translated into English within the last 20 years. And his most major books only in the last 5 or 6 years. So this is very new to all of us. Eventually, due to the Crusades and all that, a lot of Arabic material came back into Europe. And we all know about the translation projects then, because that affected the occult world as well. So astrology came along as part of that. And a lot of the Arabic material was translated into Latin. Ptolemy was reintroduced. Abu Mashar was translated. Mashallah was translated. Saul, all these Arabic authors. And some of those translations are kind of flawed. And some of the translations that they have came about sort of as an accident of history. So some of them, I think, became popular because they were available. They happen to be the ones available. We've only now noticed that there's some material missing. But that started a revival in Europe. This is probably, 13th century when this started. And you had some amazing writers at that time, Guido Bonatti, who flourished pretty much the entirety of the 13th century. I think he was nearly 100 years old when he died. He was famous for writing some books on horary. His specialty was predicting battles for the kings and lords that employed him, which, talk about pressure. Those charts are in his book. And basically, it's continually flourished, I guess, until the Enlightenment. So that's kind of the cutoff. There was a slow decline until the 17th century, and then there was a sort of like a mini Renaissance in the 1600s in England, and just tons of books started coming out in English. William Lilly, who was the first astrologer to write in English, published his massive book, Christian Astrology, which is still hugely influential. And it's a great book. And by the end of the 17th century, the Enlightenment took over. Astrology kind of went away for the most part. So did magic, for that matter. Magic and astrology have twin histories here. That's one of the things to remember. When astrology was discredited, so was magic. And then when astrology was revived, so was magic in the 19th century. That's a brief history.
Yeah, that's lovely. That's lovely. I really appreciate, and I hope the listeners do too, just that context that you're laying out. And yes, just thinking of, and I'm thinking of many previous guests as well, just sharing about that the rich tradition in the Islamic world, and just the wonderful translations and preservation and new translations and commentary on Aristotelian thought and things like that that poured into Europe from from Spain and also from the Byzantine Empire, but just that beautiful tradition. And I think this actually, Eric, leads into something that you're one of the best people to ask, which is, can you share with us about and briefly touch on the different branches, if you will, of pre-modern astrology or traditional astrology? Because for me, I remember first learning about it, coming at it from a complete kind of grimoire perspective, like calculating the right time to speak with a planetary spirit. But can you run through some of the things, as you said, like, horary astrology, natal astrology, electional, medical, mundane? What are some of the broad strokes in those categories?
So the oldest branch is probably natal. Everybody knows about natal. That's calculating a birth chart and making predictions from that. Event timing and things like that. So that's pretty easy. That's still practiced today. So that's the main branch today. Horary in I would say the 17th century was the most popular branch. Because the purpose of it is to erect a chart for a question. So the reason why it was popular is because you didn't need a birth chart. So the chart was created for the time and place that the astrologer understood the question. So it's a very important distinction, because Lilly gives an example, William Lilly, in 1641, whatever it was. Use the example of, if someone, pardon me, I have a little bit of a cough. If someone sent him a question via a letter, he would make the chart for London, which is where he was, at the moment that he opened up the letter, which is interesting. But yeah, so the whole chart is the question in a case like that. They're usually pretty quick to do. I can usually do a horary in 20 minutes. I mean, it's pretty quick to do. Lilly he used to set up shop. That's pretty much all he did all day. People would just come in off the street and ask a question. He would make his little adjustments and talk away. Electional astrology is becoming very popular today. That is finding the right astrological time to do something. So in the occult world, that's often used for a magical operation. But you can also use it for weddings, starting a business, everyday things like that. That was especially refined in the Arabic period. It was done in the Hellenistic period, but it was much more refined by the Arab. I'm going to say Arabs, but it really wasn't them necessarily. What else? Medical astrology. That's pretty much always been done as well. That is finding the nature and cure of a disease based on an astrological chart. Usually the chart is for when the person is taken to their sickbed. That's the most popular technique for that. I don't touch that with a 10-foot pole. That feels like a lawsuit waiting to happen. And then what's the last one is mundane, and mundane astrology is an astrological chart, actually more than one chart, to predict events for a place. So it'd be a city, a country, things like that, I guess, or the world if you want to be ambitious. It's exceedingly difficult to do that, and there are some astrologers who are amazing at that. I'm not good at that. That's not my specialty. That can get pretty complicated, but I've seen some excellent work done with that as well. So in the modern era, it's natal never went away, electional never went away, mundane changed a lot. that's always been here. And horary was forgotten and reintroduced in the 80s, in the 1980s, during the traditional revival.
Well, I know that I really appreciate the breakdown because I just think that's helpful because these terms, you know, for people who, such as yourself, who have the experience, the expertise, and they study it, those terms can kind of get thrown around online and it might get a little confusing. So I really appreciate that. And in terms of those expert tips as well, Eric, I know that many listeners, as you've intimated and we've touched on, use electional astrology in order to, say, calculate the best timing for a magical operation. Can you just walk through maybe a basic example or share some tips about how to read an actual chart or even how to use or execute a traditional astrological operation? Any practical tips that you have? I know
electional?
myself. Electional, yes.
Electional,
yes.
okay.
Yes.
So first you have to figure out what you want to do. So so for magical elections, you have many choices. You can elect timing for a planet or a star or a lunar mansion, which is sort of like a lunar zodiac. There's 28 of those. Or a decan, which is a 10-degree division of the zodiac. And each planet, mansion, star, and decan have a purpose. So just to give an easy example, love. So it's easy to think, okay, well, Venus is a planet for love. But if you want to make an election for Venus, you may have to wait. You may have to wait for 1 or 2 years for Venus to get into a good position. So maybe you don't want to wait 1 or 2 years. So you can find a star or a mansion or a decan that also deals with love. And you'll probably have better luck finding a more, timely election for one of those. The basic idea is the ascendant is you. So that's going to be, what is that, the 9 o'clock position of the chart. And I also left out houses, by the way. That's another election. That's complicated. I'm not going to go into that. Just for completeness sake, you can also elect with houses. Anyway, the ascendant is you, and so you want to make sure that whatever planet rules the ascendant is in a good sign for that planet. So usually it'd be ruling or exalted sign. So for the sun, let's say Leo rules the ascendant, you want to make sure the sun is going to be in either Leo or Aries, because Aries is the exalted sign for the sun. And you want to make sure that the planet that you're electing for is also in a good sign. It also has to be in a good house. Usually that means it's going to be in the 10th house. That's like 12 noon if you're looking at a clock. And you want to make sure the moon isn't messed up in some way. There's a list of that, of ways it can get messed up. And you want to make sure that the ruler of the ascendant, the planet that you're electing for, and the moon are all in good aspects with each other. And make sure that either Mars or Saturn are not negatively aspecting one of those. So all those conditions really have to be met. And then usually people will say that it should at least be done during the planetary hour for that planet. So if it's for Venus, you want it to be done in the planetary hour of Venus. And if you're able to pull it off on Friday, the day of Venus. So all these things all these moving parts have to kind of come together. It's interesting because you think of like the moon, where you have, the moon goes through all 12 signs in 1 month. You would think that the moon's the easiest one. It's not. You can wait a year to make a lunar election, because Saturn could be in a weird spot, Mars could be in a weird spot, and so whatever the good signs for the moon might be, they could be in a bad aspect with Saturn or Mars or something like that. So there's a lot of little pitfalls. And the sources say usually, like, if you make a bad election, it's either not going to work or it's going to be corrupted in some way. Usually according to how you messed up.
Thank you for sharing that, because I know for myself, and I would hope for the listeners as well, the many factors that go in there. There seems to be, and I know other magicians who do this as well, where there's always the element of how much do you want to dial this in, right? Like if you're doing a mercurial operation generally during a waxing moon, the day and hour of Mercury on a Wednesday, right, say with, Gemini over the eastern horizon, and, Mercury's not in a bad place. But then you have people who, as you say, like, you can really dial it in where maybe the lunar mansion is also, well aspected, and there's other things too. So it seems like there's this ability to dial in, right?
You have to pick your poison. Yeah. It's good to compartmentalize, because if you're doing a planetary election, let's say Venus, I don't pay attention to decans or mansions, or that's all irrelevant. Relevant. I can't talk today. It's all irrelevant when it comes to a planetary election. Now, if you're doing a lunar mansion election, that's going to be different. In that case, you want the lunar mansion to be on the ascendant, and you want the moon to also be aspecting the ascendant with a good aspect, and you want the moon to also be in a good condition and probably waxing, and things like that. But I'm not going to, I don't care what Mercury is doing necessarily for a lunar mansion, because it doesn't mean anything. That's one of the things is, in popular astrology, people make such a huge deal about Mercury retrograde, and there are times when that could be a concern, but you can do elections at any time. You can't wait for Mercury to be not retrograde. I mean, it doesn't always come into play, really. So that's why I use that example of lunar mansions, because Mercury has nothing to say about lunar mansions or fixed stars. That's another thing. You worry about the star, and you always worry about the moon. The moon's a constant in all the elections, because the moon does two things. It's a co-significator for you, but the moon in older cosmology acts as a sort of collector. It's the lowest planet in the scheme, so it acts as a collector of all of the influences for the planets and the stars and everything. So you could have the most amazing election that ever existed, but if the moon's afflicted, the moon will not be able to dispense those influences very well to us. So then you would have this amazing election with this like horrible execution in a way. So the moon's always a constant. So whether you're doing lunar mansions, planetary elections, stars, decans, you always have the moon in play.
I really appreciate that context, because we always hear in the grimoires about the sublunar realm and how the moon needs to be in a very good position and not combust with the sun. And there's all these different specific instructions. And so I think that context really, in terms of it being this collector of whatever the influences are, these stellar rays, that the moon can distribute those. But if the moon is not in a good position, it really kind of neuters that.
Or corrupts it.
Okay.
I think that's actually the word they use.
Wow. Yeah. Interesting. So this kind of, Eric, touches on another historical question that I think is pretty fascinating too, where many people might look at astrology, say historically on the Indian subcontinent, as being more ancient and more predictive than, again, quote unquote, speaking in broad terms, Western astrology. Is it as simple as that? Or can you tell us about the relationship between kind of, again, quote unquote, Western or, Hellenistic, and then astrology on the Indian subcontinent or in other parts of the world?
History is never easy. So ancient Indians did some kind of astrology, and I'm not necessarily familiar enough to know what that is. But the part that I do know is that the oldest, um, or one of the oldest Sanskrit texts on astrology is called the Jataka, which is a translation of a Greek text. And a lot of people today give a lot of broad strokes where they'll say things like Western astrology is less predictive than Indian astrology. But the reality is that Indian astrology is heavily influenced by Greek astrology or Hellenistic astrology as well. And there are a lot of similarities. A lot of the building blocks of Indian astrology are in Hellenistic astrology. There might be some elements in modern Indian astrology that maybe perhaps they used to exist and we lost it. I mean, that is a possibility. What makes it look so different today is that it went on its own course of development and became so integrated into religious practice in India that it definitely made its own branch, and it's very different today. So whatever it was back in the days of the Yavana Jataka, it has diverged and created its own branch. But there are so many similarities. And to say that it's more predictive than Western it isn't true, because it's just as predictive as at least traditional Western astrology, because that's all it was. I mean, the Greek, Arabic, and medieval and Renaissance European astrology were doing birth predictions, finding out how many children you're going to have, when you're going to die, diseases. I mean, you name it. They were doing all of the same thing. The house system's different. They use, I'm sorry, not the house, but the zodiacal system is different. They use sidereal signs. Western typically uses tropical, but for the most part, it's more similar than I think that a lot of people want to, or aware of, or some people may want to admit. But
well, you have years of experience, Eric, when it comes to traditional or pre-modern astrology, and specifically, casting, whether it's various charts, or as you mentioned, the breakdown, natal astrology or, Hori astrology. In your experience, can you share with the listeners out there, whether they've been studying astrology for years or maybe they're just getting into it, what are some of the biggest 2 or 3 things, say, that people usually might not understand about pre-modern astrology, or misconceptions that people might have about traditional astrology?
Well, this kind of goes into some of the historical thing, but the I think the defining difference between modern and traditional, and I think this is gradually changing actually, but the main difference is that in the 19th century there was a firm break that happened, or actually I think it was 18th century really, but with the development of with the Enlightenment, development of the scientific method and things like that. A lot of things happened simultaneously, because it wasn't just that magic and astrology were discredited. The people who were still interested in those things created new models to try to re-legitimize it, and that usually came into a pseudoscientific framework, like psychology and things like that. So when astrology was revived in the 19th century, it was basically done by people who had little knowledge of older material. So they had some surviving things like William Lilly that were in English. Some people could read Latin. Some of those books were hard to find. So what ended up happening was it was a combination of, I think, a lack of source material, but also a desire to move on. That created an entirely new model for astrology. So you have a lot of basic building blocks that look the same. You have planets and signs and aspects and things like that. But then they stripped out most of the predictive material and and replaced a lot of that with the psychological material. I mean, one of the early modern astrologers was Mark Edmund Jones, who was a staunch theosophist, and he and Blavatsky both made statements that they wanted to strip all the fortune telling away from astrology and replace it with this pseudoscientific jargon, which increased in the 20th century with people like Rudgar and some other people, and that sort of became the prevailing model for until the revival in the 80s. So I would say that major differences is that predictive element in earlier astrology is definitely there. But as far as misconceptions which is I think still an argument today, is the argument about fate, fate and free will, which is not unique to astrology.
Right.
But it really brings a lot of things into question because, if you're doing a horror reading, for instance, you can make pretty detailed predictions based on just purely on rules. By the way, you're not using intuition really, and coming up with concrete predictions, and those things will happen. And I don't know what that says about fate in a case like that. I did one. I'm not tooting my own horn. I was literally going by Lily in this case. I wasn't using any creativity on my part. But someone did a house buying question for me, and I didn't get many of those. So I looked up Christian Astrology by Lily, and he said, okay, well, when you're the person asking the questions, first house, the buyer or seller, depending on which end this is on, is the seventh house. The house itself is the fourth, and the price is represented by the 10th. So if the ruler of the 10th house is afflicted, the price is low. If it's strong, then the price is high. So first I had to look, okay, is there an aspect between the significator for the person asking the question and the person selling the house? Yes, there was. So there's contact. Was there a good aspect? Yes, it was a good aspect. So that meant that they receive each other amicably, And so that's a good sign for the house being sold. Well, the next question is, what's the price going to look like? So the ruler of the 10th was afflicted. It was low. And then the next question is like, okay, well, what's going on with the house? That's the fourth. That one had a minor affliction, and the significator was in an air sign. And this is where my intuition kicked in. I made a guess that it was probably the climate control system of the house. And it turned out that the seller knocked the price down because it had an oil heater, which was expensive. So he knocked the price down.
Wow.
And the guy got the house. But the thing is, like, when I say I'm not tooting my own horn, I literally just using a recipe to find that out, which I think is more impressive because, I'm not Matt and Cleo sitting here with a turban and a crystal ball making a guess. I'm literally like saying, well, what do I didn't even know what to look at. So I looked it up in a book. And so I don't know what that says about fate and free will, because it happened, as I said on that. But that's a pretty big misconception. But the argument has been going on for so long. I mean, the Greeks were arguing about it. Ptolemy believed that the stars were causes. Other astrologers believe that the stars were signs for things. But the misconception is that it's just like I guess an unthinking, robotic, outlook on fate. Was I don't think was ever true. Maybe some Stoics, but
That is so fascinating, Eric, because I was just reading an article about in the medieval period, high scholasticism and opposition to magical practices. And this exact discussion was going on where there was, well, if it's natural magic, then it's okay because you're exploiting forces that might be occult, they might be hidden, but they're latent in nature. And then when it came to astrology, depending on the scholastic that you were talking to, this touches, and correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, right on your point, because some people said, well, this is clearly diabolic because even though it might be a calculation, spirits, negative spirits have to be involved. Mm-hmm. But then others argued and said, well, no, if the calculations of the heavens and specific astrological calculations reveal something about the nature of God, or how we should approach, our rituals or our approach to God and divinity, then it can be permissible. So there seems to be that tension was always there.
It's always been there. The one kind of astrology that was always allowed by the church was medical. So
interesting.
The argument was never whether or not astrology existed. It was what was okay. And so medical astrology was okay because that was medicine. Of course, the fear in the, if we're picking on the Catholic Church here, the fear is going to be, what are you going to use predictive tools for? And that was a fear that happened all the way, in the ancient Roman period. I think it was Tiberius outlawed astrology for a while because he was afraid people were going to make predictions for his death. Of course, Tiberius had his own astrologer, who was I'm running a blank on his name all of a sudden. He was one of the early scholars of Aristotle. I can't think of his name all of a sudden. Famous astrologer. But yeah, these are arguments that have always happened. Even in modern astrology, they're still doing predictions. They're still, I still think that even if you're using astrology as a therapeutic tool, you're really using a kind of a non-physical, spooky medium to arrive to make prognostications about somebody. So whether you're using astrology to predict, am I going to get a job next year, or if you're trying to use astrology to find out why you have trauma in the past, I mean, you're still neither one's really scientific, first of all, and second of all, both of them I think do mess with the whole fate question. Because why? Even if you're doing psychological astrology, then what does it have to say? What do the planetary positions have to say about the fact that you experience trauma? It's a very slippery argument to me.
Well, earlier, Eric, to your exact point, in this broader discussion about fate, you also touched a few moments ago on the Renaissance in the 80s. And so I think this leads to the next question, which is, can you share with us about how have some translations and reprints of astrological materials in the last 30 years or so, how have they pushed the rediscovery of ancient astrology? What's the relationship between those recent prints or reprints?
Yeah, it's an interesting evolution, and I've happened to have watched some of it real time, which is fascinating. But the first thing that happened was in the 80s. Olivia Barclay got a copy of William Lilly's Christian Astrology, and it was cheap. Nobody wanted it. And, the first or the second volume of his book, which is a very large portion of it, is on horary. And she wasn't that familiar with it. Some horary was practiced. There were some books that were written in the 20s. But Lilly had a much richer, detailed account. So she was the first one that I know that sort of took that on its own terms. And that was happening, but then privately, Robert Zoller was doing his own work translating Bonatti, and he didn't really get published or went public until probably the 90s. But he was actually working with it as far back as the 70s. And so these things were sort of quietly happening. Olivia Barclay started a course in the 80s, and that kind of started the first generation of people. And it was purely horary astrology. People weren't really working with traditional natal yet. And by the 90s, there was by then we had English translations of Ptolemy, because that never went away. And there was, I think by then, a translation of Dorotheus. I think that came out in the 80s. Or 70s, I can't remember. So we had a couple things out there. The astrologers weren't paying attention to it at all. And so in the 90s, the three Roberts, Robert Zoller, Robert Hand, and Robert Schmidt, started Project Hindsight, which was was meant to be an organized effort to translate Greek and Latin texts into English. And so they did the first push. They published a few books. Many of them were never finished. Some were. Most of them are out of print now. And Robert Schmidt kind of started the whole kind of like redefining what the words meant. Things like, kind of revisiting what a sign was, for instance. Or what the aspects were, why they were. And he was really trying to, because he was a mathematician, so he was trying to kind of dig into some of the logic. I don't always agree with all of his logic, but a lot of it was, it was a good thing that had happened, and I do agree with some of it. And from that, it just the floodgates opened up, and so that was in the 90s, and so there were some academic efforts. David Pingree published a bunch of works. He published the critical edition of Picatrix. By the early 2000s, we had Benjamin Dykes started publishing a lot of Latin material, and most recently he's been working with Arabic material. He speaks Arabic now. Which I think is hugely important. But this also dovetails with some academic work being done. So now, for the first time, are you familiar with Hanegraaff?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So he's really influenced, I think, a kind of a wave of work being done, and I think it was him who influenced it. He's the one I know about, and we now have a lot of scholarly work done, not just on astrology, but magic. And, we have, Abu Mashar's been academically translated and things like that. So there's just, over the last, especially in the last 20 years, it's just been a huge push. So really since the 2000s, we now have people working with traditional natal astrology. And so you have some people specializing in the Hellenistic material only, some with the medieval only, some with Renaissance only. I'm trying to bridge a gap personally. I'm trying to work up a synthesis, because I really think there's something there. So yeah, there's when I started studying it, I think there was a small handful of people. It was the Hindsight people, Demetra George, Christopher Warnock, Robert Zoller, Benjamin Dykes. There's a few people. But ever since then, it's just, especially with the young people coming into this, they don't quite have the barriers that the old people had. And so they don't really care about these divisions that we've set up between modern and traditional. So I know a lot of younger people are trying to synthesize both sides of the aisle a little bit, which I think is very interesting. It's a very interesting effort.
Actually, to your very point, Eric, about synthesis and kind of feeling the waters with all of this, which I know when I first started learning about astrology, again, coming at it from a grimoire perspective, I was just absorbing material, right? And just like finding out, okay, what can I use? to all of that, we have a listener question for you. A listener question from Dennis of the excellent Foolish Fish YouTube channel. And so I have to say, in addition to supporting Eric Purdue, please make sure to check out, subscribe to Foolish Fish, excellent esoteric content, and just a great guy. And so Foolish Fish is asking and saying, "Hi, Eric. Astrology has been a bit of a blind spot for me, probably for too long now. It's not quite so bad nowadays, but still, I could definitely not say I've explored the topic deeply. As someone to whom people often turn to get book recommendations, I've been pointing people to The Only Astrology Book You'll Ever Need by Johanna Martine Woolfolk, mainly because so many people have recommended it to me, as well as the fantastic Ancient Astrology double volume by Demetra George, depending on the kind of flavor the requester seems to prefer." So Foolish Fish is asking and saying, what are the books, Eric, that got you started? And would you recommend them for a beginner or at all for that matter, given what you now know?
First of all, the only astrology book you'll ever need is False Advertising, sort of like The Never-Ending Story.
Okay, all right.
I always laugh about that. So, hello, Mr. Fish, by the way.
Yeah, he is absolutely awesome. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. So, well, yeah, he mentioned Demetra George's book, which is excellent. It's a 2-volume book on mostly, I think it's pretty much Hellenistic astrology. So her book, you have Chris Brennan's book on Hellenistic astrology called Hellenistic Astrology. And the third book I'd recommend is by Avelar and I can't pronounce it, Ribeiro. It's Portuguese, and I apologize. It's called On the Heavenly Spheres. And I think they all start at beginner levels. I would say Chris Brennan and Demetra George's books probably get more in depth, and they're concentrating on Hellenistic material. What I like about On the Heavenly Spheres is that it's very plainly written for beginners. So if you know absolutely nothing, I might start there. It just goes through all the basics, and it goes through basic chart synthesis as well, how to read a chart. It doesn't go into a lot of really deep predictive materials. So the thing in traditional astrology, you have kind of 3 elements of prediction, or delineation, I should say, because you have what the planet's doing. You have the so like the house that it's in, things like that. You have what are often called the Arabic parts or lots, which are kind of complicated to explain, but they're points on the chart that are based on a calculation, a mathematical calculation. I'm not going to go too deep into it. But you have lots on like father or mother. So if you want to find out about your father, you would look at or your family, you look at the 4th house, the ruler of the 4th house. And they'll tell you part of it. The Arabic part or the lot of father and mother will tell you about those. And then you have special techniques. That's the third thing. So there are special techniques for things like finding the number of children, for instance, or marriage or whatever, things like that. So you can look at, basically take 3 things and you sort of triangulate them together into a prediction. So On the Heavenly Spheres doesn't go into the other stuff quite so much. It goes into the kind of the more basic, which I think is great if you're beginning. You could do a lot with that, to be honest with you. Their emphasis is on Renaissance astrology, so William Lilly mostly. So I think for an absolute beginner who knows nothing, that's probably a good place to start. But I am not minimizing Demetra George and Chris Brennan's books. They are excellent books, and they also start with very basic knowledge. I just kind of like the other one for someone who knows nothing, because it gives kind of a broader, easier overview, I think. But we're gonna get all three. Actually, get all three books. I'll say that, because I hate like putting the other ones behind it. So,
touche. Yes, and yeah, to the excellent question with Dennis from Foolish Fish, I'm right there too, and so I really appreciate the context that you're sharing, Eric, right now, because that's helping me understand so much. And then with those recommendations, that's excellent. And this actually touches on something that is the opposite of what we've been talking about, and it's a listener question we have from JT Lopez, and JT Lopez is asking, Eric, does modern astronomy contribute anything new to the science of the spirit? So can you share a little bit about modern astronomy and the relationship there?
I sort of, I'm not sure entirely how to answer that question, to be honest. Because I mean, my default answer is I don't think modern astronomy has anything to do with the study of spirit. I personally don't spend a lot of time trying to reconcile science and magic and astrology, because I think, how do I say it? They're approaching reality in two different ways, entirely different ways. And I tend to want to compartmentalize them a lot. So I don't really know if modern astronomy has contributed to the science of spirit, perhaps, per se. I think part of what he was asking me was it maybe in the follow-up
Yes.
about the signs. I think
yes.
It does, so it does dovetail into that a little bit. So one of the things that comes about because of social media, about once every couple of years, is that NASA has discovered a 13th sign. And I like making fun of this because what I always say that saying that NASA discovered a 13th sign is like saying that Home Depot discovered an extra foot in a yardstick. There's no like A, reason why they would do that to begin with, and B, why would NASA make an announcement saying this? So this is a very common, I guess, criticism done by people who don't do astrology, that Western astrologers don't know where the signs are because they've moved. So I wrote a little blog post about this on my site. But if you look at the ancient literature, there is a distinction between signs and constellations. And there's a logic to all this. So first of all, I guess I need to start with some basic astronomy here. Most of the astrological bodies that we pay attention to hover around a belt of the sky that's called the ecliptic. And the ecliptic is the path that the sun moves on, the invisible belt. And all of the planets hover around that belt. They're either above or below it slightly, or on it. And all of the 12 signs also hover around that belt. They're usually on it, they touch it usually. Or they're like right next to it. And part of the confusion is that Ophiuchus, the so-called 13th sign, is also it's near Scorpio, basically. So it's also kind of touching the ecliptic. So like, well, why don't you have Ophiuchus? It's a 13th sign. So the reality is, people don't believe me, but it's, first of all, astrologers and astronomers from the beginning of measurements and paying attention to the sky have noticed that the stars move. They move very slowly. This is due to a wobble in the rotation of the Earth. And this is basically, it takes roughly 2,000 years or so for a sign to kind of move, or sorry, a constellation to move all the way over. And that's called precession of the equinoxes. But the thing is that if you actually look at the sky and you actually look at what the constellations are, whether it's with software or your eyes, you'll see that the constellations are irregular, and some are really huge and some are really small. And sometimes they kind of do a little puzzle piece overlap. And so what the ancients did was they standardized this. And so they took the ecliptic, they made equal the 12 equal 30-degree divisions. And those 12 equal 30-degree divisions are the signs. And the constellations happen to be near them. Nobody knows what came first. We don't know if the signs are named after the constellations or vice versa, chicken and the egg a little bit. The reason why there are 12 is because there are 12 lunations in a year, 12-ish, not 13. So that's why there's not 13. That's why it's not Ophiuchus. They decided to leave Ophiuchus out. Ophiuchus was always known about. Ptolemy wrote about it. And this has been like a huge thing, a huge argument. So there are two kinds of zodiacs. You have the tropical zodiac and you have the sidereal zodiac. So what a lot of people will say is that the sidereal is more scientifically accurate. The difference between the two is that the tropical resets every year on the spring equinox. So every year on the spring equinox, the sun is always going to be 0 degrees Aries. Because the constellations move, right now the sun is somewhere in Pisces on the spring equinox. So in tropical astrology, sun's in Aries. In Vedic astrology, they use sidereal. And sidereal makes that 0 point, the starting point of the zodiac, on some star. And because the precession, the equinoxes, the stars move, the signs have moved with the stars. But the reason why that is also not scientifically accurate is because Indian astrology, using sidereal signs, still use an idealized 30-degree division of the zodiac. So no matter which system you use, the constellations are never going to exactly match what you have in the software versus what you see in the sky. So the argument really here, the reasoning between the two is that tropical is based on the seasons and sidereal is based on the stars. So I guess it depends what bothers you the most. Western astrology is stuck mostly with tropical because there's an internal logic with it. Because according to like someone like Ptolemy, who believed that the stars were causes or the planets were causes, the signs had to kind of match the seasons in, at least as they are in the Mediterranean, not so much in Australia. But the beginning of the year is Aries, astrologically. So yeah, the springtime, things are starting to get warm. Aries is a fire sign. Summer happens, you go into Cancer, it's warm and moist, it's humid, all that kind of stuff. And it kind of follows that logic until you get to winter, you're in Capricorn, it's cold, Capricorn's cold. Yeah, so it follows that internal logic. So I guess, like I said, what bothers you more? I don't know. Do you really do you need the constellations to be closer to where the signs are? Then use sidereal. If you want to go with the internal elemental logic that really is all throughout astrology as a whole, then you use tropical. But the truth of the matter is that all astrologers during the Hellenistic period, medieval period, Renaissance period, all the way to modern day, every single one tracks the stars separately according to precession of the equinoxes. They've always done that. So there is no conflict between having, just to make up an example, to have the sun being in Aries in spring equinox, but then have a star in Aries actually being in Pisces. You can have both of those things at the same time, and it does exist. We've always done it.
And I think, again, listeners, no, that is, again, wonderful context. And check out the listeners, the links below as well to Eric's blog post. And I think this as well, Eric, if you do have any additional thoughts, because you mentioned that follow-up question from JT Lopez, where exactly JT references this, saying, I keep referencing your blog post. The signs are not constellations when contemplating the tension between the non-physical / philosophical components versus what we actually see in the sky. And so JT in the follow-up was asking, where do you, Eric, personally fall on this scale?
Well, the signs where I fall and what the implication with the Hellenistic material is that the signs are not physical. They exist in the realm of the forms. And if you look at some of the cosmological models, I think even the medieval period, you would see the planetary spheres, and then you have the stars with the constellations, and then you have the signs above that. That's kind of what that's talking about, because the signs are so, if you think about, I guess the logic they're using here is that, the forms are, for those who don't know, are non-physical primary ideas that reality refers to. So if, for instance, the form of chair is going to be the seed for all chairs in the world, even though every single chair may look different. So the chair, your lazy boy chair, your mom and dad's house, is going to look different than a chair in church. But you recognize both as being chairs. Well, that's because they both partake of the form of chair. So the form itself is this sort of eternal, non-physical part of the divine world that, informs reality. And the forms kind of come from that, or not forms, but the signs are in that same region. Because especially when you start getting into medieval and Renaissance thought, the will of so basically God thinks something into reality. Well, that thing that goes into reality has to go through different stages. The first stage that it goes through is usually the form stage, and that's where the numbers exist. That's where the signs exist. All sorts of things. So then the signs are giving the first part of reality to matter. And then that idea, as it's filtered through the form of the sign, gets filtered down through the planetary spheres until you get whatever we have here. That's the logic. And the stars have their own little business going on as well. But they're of a lower order. They're physical. So, and this is one of the things that I've said often, is that, at its heart, astrology is not a physical science. This is one of the reasons why I think there's always going to be tension between modern science and astrology, amongst a lot of other reasons. But one of the reasons is that, to me, and classically, astrology is an expression of a philosophy. I mean, a lot of the framework of astrology comes from Timaeus and from Phaedrus and some other Platonic dialogues. Or from some of the ideas of Aristotle and from Pythagoras, things like that. I mean, the original aspects that they use, the trine, sextile, opposition, and all that, those are based on Platonic number, or not Platonic, but Pythagorean numbers. So, these all already have a philosophical component built into it. Whether you like the philosophy, I don't know, but what it means is that the foundation of philosophy astrology is from the mind, and you're kind of using a physical tool, i.e., the planets and stars, as a way of measuring it and making predictable models of it. But the source of it is actually coming from the mind. And I don't mean that in a psychological way. I'm talking mind in the hermetic, bigger sense.
So if you were to boil it down, Eric, as you just said, is that astrology, astrological operations, calculations, considerations, effectively is a philosophy of the mind, again, in that kind of hermetic context. Whereas if you approach something strictly from a scientific, or you're seeing things through the monocle of materialistic validation and scientific astronomical considerations, it's just completely different.
It is different. The logic's different, and there's no love between astrology and astronomers to begin with, and but yeah, I mean, the purpose of astronomy is not to make predictions, or not to help you make your talismans more powerful. You know, the purpose of astronomy is to study physical objects, and we can, I think at this point, I think the measurements that we have in astrology are as accurate as they're going to be. I mean, they're more accurate than they ever have been because we have computers doing that now. But sure, astronomers will find extra planets and asteroids and things like that, and some people pay attention to that. I don't. I use 7 planets. I don't even know where Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are in my chart anymore. Some modern traditional astrologers do use them. Some use asteroids. I know Dimitri George uses asteroids. That's one of her major passions is asteroids. But for me, there's a lot you can get out of those 7 planets. So, I mean, astronomers can find 1,000 new planets in our solar system. It's not really going to affect how I do it, because again, I'm less interested in this physical ball of rock in the in the sky, and I'm more interested in what information it's going to give me. And I'm paraphrasing, but in a book, there's a quote from the Encyclopedia de Ikhwan al-Safa, where it says something to the effect, and again I'm paraphrasing, that come with me, brother, to the Temple of Hermes, where we study the science of the stars, not the physical stars of the astronomers, but the stars of the philosophers. I mean, it's spelled out right. It's it's Arabic, but it's spelled out right there. That's the intention of it.
That's so beautiful, and I think that touches on something that has been discussed a lot on this podcast, which is the relationship in the grimoire tradition too. That if you want to, you can see things through strictly the monocle of materialistic reality. That's fine, but what magical operations are describing, the way I've kind of thought about it is, instead of operating on the laws of physics, the magical art and science operates on the laws of meaning and specific engagements that are there and that are built on hundreds and hundreds of years of specific patterns and using materia magica, nomina magica, verba ignota, things like that. And so hearing you describe that, I think with astrology sounds very, very similar to that.
Yeah. When I do astrology readings, every single time I light a candle on my ancestral altar. And I actually, anymore, I've gotten to the point where I have a lot of things internalized, but I previously do some calculations that I can't do quickly, ahead of time in some notes. But the rest of it, I'm just kind of like, I'm just sort of doing it. And I found that I'm using astrology the entire time. I'm using astrological logic. But there's times when, there's a reading. I wish I could do this every reading, and I can't. But there was one reading where someone wanted me to asked about their son. And, I saw that it was like, Mercury was like, it was either in Gemini or Virgo, and it was combust the sun. And I said, and it was a ruler of the 5th house. And I said, oh, okay, well, your son has, I don't know why I would have said this, because I wouldn't even say it now. I was just starting out. But I told her, I'm like, okay, well, he has like I think he has a mild form of autism. And she said that's what the doctor said. And, I was using astrological logic, and that's not going to be true. You can't use a cookbook for that. Not every single time when Mars rules or Mercury rules the fifth house and is in its own sign and combusts the sun is a person going to have that same affliction. That's of course can't be true. But I pulled it out of there somehow. I don't know how I did it, and that's the the sort of divine mind, mediumistic, spiritual part of it coming through. And I think every astrologer does that, even if they don't know it, because there's times when, to give a sort of a more flippant example, if you have on the 10th house, which is career, you have Mars ruling the 10th. So Mars is fire. So you could say things like, that person's going to be a firefighter. They're going to be in the military. They're going to be a chef. They're going, all sorts of things, a blacksmith, whatever. There is some intuition that comes in where you kind of pull out an answer from that. And so, maybe it's not a firefighter this time. Maybe they're in the military, but next time it is firefighting. Or, I had one that had Mars and Venus conjunct the 10th house, and the person was a tattoo artist, which I thought was kind of interesting, because you have needles and blood, that's Mars, and then you have the art, which is Venus.
That is so cool. And I love that term, by the way, Eric, astrological logic, because I think it's not invalidating or opposing, science and material reality. Of course, that is an integral part of reality, but it is a completely different level. It is a completely different plane, dimension of meaning and relationships.
Sphere, perhaps.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and isn't it funny too, Eric, not to get all, but you really just, I think, articulate that so well, which is, we are constantly seeking to measure things by this material reality, which is completely, a valid aspect of reality. But most of our relationships, whether it's relationships with spirits, entities in the grimoires, whether it's I love this person or this member of my family, whatever it is, we measure our relationships not by material reality, but by meaning and the feelings that we have and the relationship, whether that's a spirit in the grimoire or someone And so I just love how you articulate that about it's not invalidating anything that is in reality, but it's another dimension of reality. It's a much more comprehensive, this astrological logic, this, grimoire logic, if you will. It's just a different level. I mean,
a simple different examples can be tarot cards. How do tarot cards work?
Right.
Because they're just printed at a factory on a piece of flimsy cardboard, and that has absolutely, they're not doing any magical elections in the printing factory or press or whatever to print the cards. The people printing it aren't doing any kind of magical operation to like infuse power into those cards whatsoever. Yet people are making predictions all the time from that. So there's that same combination I'm talking about with astrology, where you have this physical reality that the cards have, and people are getting more meaning than the cards are literally telling you. I mean, the cards are only going to tell you so much from a literal standpoint, but people are able to elicit a lot more out of that. And with it should be a no-brainer with astrologers, in my mind, because, why would the ball of rock that is the moon tell us something different than the ball of rock that is Venus? But we do it all the time.
Totally. Absolutely, Eric. And, again, listeners, check out the links below, because Eric, you have, years of practical experience, but also the way you share things, it's so helpful to me, and I'm sure for many others, just to understand the basics. But you're also a scholar, you're a researcher. And I think in addition to this, Eric, we have a listener question for you from Chronojourner. I love that name, by the way. I was telling Chronojourner that. I love that.
It's all from me. I'm kidding.
So Chronojourner is asking and saying, "Hi, Eric. Would you consider translating Al-Kindi's on the stellar rays? It's a very important early work in both astrology and magic. The original Arabic version is lost and only the Latin remains, and the only translations into English," Chronojourner says, "are either incomplete or widely considered to be clunky." So, Eric, what do you think of Al-Kindi's on the stellar rays?
I have thought about that, but I think there have been some recent efforts. I don't know the quality, but I wish I wasn't prepared for this one. But I think that there was I feel like that there was an academic one recently that came out. And I think one of the occult presses did one recently.
I believe there have been some efforts as well. However, for Chronojourner's question, and maybe for the listeners, can you just give us kind of the broad strokes on what the On the Stellar Rays contains? Just kind of broad strokes.
Yeah, it's almost like a precursor to the more philosophical sections of 3 books of occult philosophy in some ways. Al-Kindi was a major Arabic astrologer and magician, and it essentially has a really nice flowing layout on a magical worldview in a nutshell. He has kind of a more materialistic bent on the causality, which is the stellar rays themselves, but it's a wonderful lyrical book, and whatever version people can get, I recommend it. I will have to do some research because I feel like there's an academic version that just came out, and I might be confusing it with a Thabit Ibn Qura one that came out recently, but I feel like there was one that just came out. But if there isn't one that's recent and it's not good, then maybe I might consider it.
Well, and listeners and for Chronojourner and everyone else, make sure to check out the video description and the podcast description as well, because if Eric finds a link, we'll definitely make sure to put it down there as well. And as well, Eric, every now and then we get very controversial questions, I should say, on the Glitch Bottle podcast, very contentious, and I don't want to pit one side versus another side, but we do have a listener question for you. This is a culinary question from JT Lopez, and maybe you might need to provide some background info on your kind of where you've lived. JT Lopez is asking, I'll just ask it, Eric, do you miss Chicago-style deep dish pizza?
Deeply.
Well said.
It's a very bitter subject for me. I'm from Illinois, and I used to live in Chicago for about 12 years. And I am not a purist with Chicago style pizza, but I love New York style pizza equally as well as Chicago style pizza. But there is something about the pizza that is east of the Mississippi that is far superior. And I don't know what it is. There's a Chicago style pizza place here in Seattle that is pretty close, but I don't know what it is. There's something missing. I don't know if it's the water. Maybe there's not enough hot dog water.
Maybe.
Because even like in Chicago, even the crappy corner pizza is amazing.
Yeah. When I've eaten the pizza in Chicago, when I used to live in Chicago years ago, more than a decade plus ago, there's something. Chicago style pizza carries its own gravity. Like there's something about it that just pulls you in, and I don't know if it's a specific ingredient or if it's a menagerie of things coming together. I don't know what it is. You're right.
Menagerie. It's the sauce. It's the crust.
Yes.
Something about that. And then Detroit, awesome. That's a whole other category. I mean, they have their own thing going on and that no one else is duplicating.
Right. Exactly. So
there you go. Pans, right? You have those special like iron pans or whatever they are.
Yes. Yes.
Or metal or whatever they're made of.
Specific shapes and everything else. Exactly. So there you are, JT. So, well, Eric,
thanks for making me feel horrible.
Hey, you know what? You were just defending and sharing your opinion, sir. That is awesome. And definitely, listeners, there'll be an after show for Glitch Bottle patrons where Eric is going to share a little bit about some of the feedback and some of the just updates since his amazing 3 books of occult philosophy and incredible scholarly work was released. But as we round out the main podcast, Eric, can you share with us? You are such a busy guy. You're always working on things. Can you share about what else are you working on? What else are you thinking about? And then also, how can people support you? How can they check out your website, your magical services, anything that you'd like to share with people?
Well, my website is ericpurdue.com, and I have everything that I do on there. I am procrastinating about starting my own video or podcast / YouTube in direct competition with Alexander. I'm just,
oh, please. I couldn't hold a candle to you. Forget it.
You're going down. No, it's not going to be the same thing, but it's astrologically based.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And I am working on several projects at the same time. I have 2 that are very lengthy, that are going to take multiple years probably. That's not going to be my next project though, because I don't want to wait another 10 years to have something out there. So I'm working on a shorter translation of an astrological text that's been translated, but it's been a while, and it's out of print. And I also found reason to do a new one. New critical editions have come out, and so I'm able to take advantage of all that. That'll probably be out fairly quickly because it's not a very big book. Next year and a half, probably.
Well, Eric, we will definitely keep our ear to the ground on that. And listeners, check out the podcast and video descriptions to check out Eric's website, services, and also blog posts as well. Practitioner of medieval astrology, author, scholar, Santero and Lukumi Santeria.
Pizza enthusiast.
In 100%. Most importantly, Eric Purdue. Eric, thank you just so much, as always, just for taking the time and sharing your time and your wisdom on the podcast today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.